Hello, and I bid everybody a very warm welcome to the Digital Summit and to our panel, Who Influences Digital Policies, with which we want to investigate who is lobbying whom, how are they doing it, and what are the actual issues at stake. My name is Alexandra Geese. I'm a member of the European Parliament from Germany. I'm part of the Green Party, and I'm a shadow rapporteur for the Digital Services Act. So that's the first lesson in Eurospeak, Brussels speak. What is a shadow rapporteur? It's that person of a political group in the European Parliament that really works on the nitty and gritty of a legislative dossier, in my case, of the Digital Services Act. So I'm all into digital policy. And as a policymaker, I'm obviously a very interesting target of lobbying. So lobbyists come to my office, I get invited to think tanks, I get invited to panels, which I later find out are financed by some of those big companies whose name we all know. And therefore I started investigating into how this works. Because when you start hearing the same message wherever you go, you wonder, how is this? Is this just the truth? Or is there someone spreading the same message in all places? And therefore, I started getting really interested in this topic. And I realized, with the help of one of the guests, for example, that is here, that I will introduce in a few minutes, that big tech companies are spending more and more money on lobbying in Europe, which is a clear sign of the industry's growing power. They spend almost 100 million each year trying to influence EU institutions, according to a very recent study by NGOs like Corporate Europe Observatory and Lobby Control, which we'll hear more about in a few seconds. Silicon Valley giants, especially Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Apple, are among the biggest single spenders in Brussels. And the increased lobbying efforts reflect the importance of political battles and negotiations that we're currently having with the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and also the proposed AI regulation. And since the Parliament started discussing the DSA, and since I was appointed a shadow rapporteur, I continue to be flooded with meeting requests and lobbying emails. But what is particularly interesting, I think, here is the asymmetry of power and the asymmetry of access to policymakers, and especially to the Commission, who has a very important part because it sets out the first proposal, it writes the first proposal. And we see that those companies have a lot more access than, for example, normal citizens, consumers, NGOs, and this sort of mirrors the asymmetry of knowledge we all have in the digital world. We have these huge companies that know all about us and we don't know anything. So I started looking around for people to help me. The problem is that many of the think tanks we have in Brussels are funded by the same companies. And then you look out, obviously, for independent academia, for independent experts, and you find out that, for example, the Oxford Institute takes quite a lot of money from these companies. Humboldt University, one of the best universities we have in Germany, or just to stay in Germany, there is TU Munich, where the Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence is funded by Facebook. And so you start questioning whoever you talk to, because you really, as a policymaker in Brussels, you don't have all that time to figure out who these people are you're talking to. You think if they're independent experts, they are probably paid by taxpayers, by universities, which are publicly funded. They give you independent knowledge and independent insight, but unfortunately, that is not always the case. And this is why I'm really investigating this, why I think this is really a very serious issue. And today we are looking into how this lobbying works and what are the issue at stakes. And I'm very, very happy to introduce my great guests. First of all, we have Margarida Silva, who is a researcher and campaigner at Corporate Europe Observatory, a research and campaign group working to expose and challenge the privileged access and influence enjoyed by corporations and their lobby groups in EU policy making. Great to have you tonight, Margarida.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for the invitation.
Then, in order to integrate also the US perspective, I'm very glad to be able to welcome Dr. Burcu Kilic, who is a scholar, a lawyer, and a digital rights advocate. She directs the digital rights program at Public Citizen a consumer advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., that champions public interest in the halls of power. She has researched and written extensively on intellectual property, innovation, digital rights, and trade, and provided technical advice and assistance in numerous countries in Asia, Latin America, Europe, and Africa. And tonight you are helping us here in Europe. Welcome to you, Burcu.
Hi. Hi.
And third, we have John von Tetzchner. He is co-founder and CEO of Vivaldi, and before starting the Vivaldi web browser, he launched a community site called VivaldiNet. Prior to this, he co-founded Opera Software, and he told me before he has been around in the digital world almost since the beginning. This is something we can still say in digital. This is amazing. Very happy to have you here tonight, John.
Thank you.
And we might have later Professor Tommaso Valletti, who I think has connection issues. So I will skip his introduction for the moment since he's not here yet. But if you see a fourth face coming up on the screen, that's Professor Tommaso Valletti, and I will introduce him when it's his turn to speak, if he manages to show up. So first of all, I would like to say how we proceed tonight. We have 3 or 4, according to whether Professor Valletti makes it or not, interventions of 5 to 7 minutes, I believe. And then we have time for questions. So you see a little window on the right with the chat and the questions, and you can put the questions in, and I will choose a few questions, as many questions as possible, to ask our guests after their first intro speeches. So this is very interactive, so feel free to ask questions. And off we go. We start with Margarida. Margarida, I think you have brought us a presentation, and you will set the scene. You will explain how lobbying in Brussels works. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for having me. And I have to say that you've done already a great job actually contextualizing the issue of lobbying and the power of big tech lobbying at EU level. So at CEO, at Corporate Europe Observatory, we have been basically tracking lobbying and corporate influence in EU policymaking for about 25 years. In the last 10 years or so, we started seeing that tech companies, especially companies like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, Amazon, they were becoming bigger and bigger and quite unavoidable if you were following and tracing lobbying issues. And they were always present and always very active whenever there was a discussion on data protection, on advertising, on copyright. So really they were coming to the forefront of lobbying discussions. So then we wanted to see exactly who is lobbying actually on issues of the digital economy, and how they do it and what their budgets are. For this, we partnered up with the sister organization Lobby Control, and we did a deep dive into the lobbyists of the digital economy. What we found was quite a wide and varied universe of actors, about 612 companies and business associations that were very active in the area. Together, these 612 actors, they were spending almost 100 million euros a year. So that's quite substantial for EU level. But maybe even more importantly for us, we found that there was quite an unequal balance in the spending. So as you see here, and I hope that maybe we can zoom in on this presentation, on the presentation, the top 10 digital industry lobbyists, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, Huawei, together they spend about a third of the entire spend of the tech industry. The top 3 companies, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, they're spending over 5 million euros lobbying per year at the EU institutions. And that is not big just for the digital industry, that's big overall. These 3 companies are now the companies that spend the most money lobbying the EU institutions and policymaking. And this lobbying has an impact on policymaking. It has an impact on how officials, EU officials, and policymakers like MEPs and others can do the job or do their job. One of the things that we looked into was, for instance, the level of access. And here we can, apologies, getting used to the software. We looked into the lobbying, the lobby meetings of the high level of the EU Commission, during discussions of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, two of the big proposals that are currently under discussion at EU level. And we found there that there had been basically around 271 meetings that we could label as being on these issues, and that 75% of them had actually been with business interests. Not only that, as Google and Facebook took the lead here. This is already quite a substantial find, we find, but on top of that, we have to take into consideration that this is only a portion and probably quite a small portion of the entire lobbying that takes place. We, for instance, don't have access to the lower levels in EU Commission. That includes policy officers, the people that actually draft the policy. But we also don't have very good transparency or very good understanding of the lobbying that takes place in other EU institutions. For instance, like the European Parliament, which is currently discussing the policies. We don't have still very uniform approach to transparency there, so we cannot see exactly the lobbying that takes place there. Even worse, I would say, is the Council. So that's the institution where member states come together and discuss and shape proposals for policy at EU level. And there, basically, the Council is often referred to as the black box of EU policy making. And that's because of two pretty big reasons. One, there's no centralized obligation for lobby transparency at this level, so it will depend quite often on the national level laws, and quite often those are pretty bad. But on top of that, we often also don't know what our governments are actually defending at EU level, so we cannot even trace the influence when it happens. This, combined with the fact that we have that to lobby at council level, you effectively have to lobby 27 different capitals with different cultures, different languages even, which makes it really quite hard, and really only the actors that have either the resources or the pre-existing access can do it. This, plus the opacity of the council decision making, makes it really one of the weak parts of EU policymaking, and makes it quite vulnerable to corporate lobbying. Here in the presentation, I'm showing you what we found when it came to Estonia. Estonia has pretty good transparency law, so we could see who they were meeting when they were discussing the Digital Markets Act. These are the meetings of the Ministry of Justice of Estonia. And they had 7 meetings, and all but one had been with big tech companies. Not only that, as Apple was quite fortunate enough to have been granted 3 different meetings, one of them at ministry level. This is just one small example, but it shows that on one hand, we know that big tech companies are lobbying at the capital level, and the second hand, we know that others aren't, and they are unable to match that influence. But there's quite a lot more, I think, to say about council, and we can come back to it during the Q&A. But this, so far, we are discussing is direct lobbying, what most people associate with lobbying, actually. Companies going outside and talking to the policymakers on their own right and properly identifying themselves. But there's a whole other part that MEP Geese has referred to of lobbying at EU level, which we call indirect lobbying. And that really comes from the financing of third parties and trying to set the narrative for public discussion. And at EU level, we see quite a problem with, for instance, the funding of think tanks and other policy groups. Here we see that there's a list of 14 policy groups that have quite close ties with big tech companies. We have this list right now, and it's mostly because we've made quite a lot of pressure on the companies and the think tanks to release it. And this is quite important for the lobbying of the companies for a variety of reasons. Some of these will just be PR management. Just it's important for the companies to be seen as being given money, giving money to some of these institutes. For other of these institutes, they will actually be more of an active part of the lobbying strategy of the companies. They will be hosting events on behalf of the funders, events that are quite often not public, or they are held under rules where you cannot disclose what the policymakers that are participating there are saying. Or sometimes they also put out position papers that are quite favorable to their funders, this case, big tech. And then they send those position papers to the policymakers, sometimes without even disclosing that there is a conflict of interest or that there's a potential bias in the research. One interesting thing that happened during the discussions of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act was that before the publication of the proposals by the European Commission, Google's lobbying strategy actually was leaked to the press. And for us, this is quite an interesting example because it basically confirmed a lot of our suspicions that the companies were actively pushing back against the rules and that they were doing it by a very toolkit that included directly lobbying at different levels at the same time, so Parliament, Commission, and Council, but also doing a wider appeal to try and mobilize, have allies, third parties, think tanks, academics that are friendly to them, have them echo their message in ways that help to reset the narrative. And this is what I would maybe leave with right now, because it's important to know not only that the companies are lobbying, but what they are lobbying for. For a really long time, the companies were basically trying to just block any regulation. They were simply saying that they are good enough to regulate themselves and they didn't need any policymakers to interfere. But since the variety of scandals that have come on, especially Cambridge Analytica, they know and they knew that rules were coming either way. So they've changed gears and now they are saying publicly, actually, we do support regulation. But then when you go and look into the detail, the regulation that they support is often self-regulation, quite soft, or things that don't actually threaten their business model and their profits. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Margarida. I think that was a perfect first introduction, and I think we will come back to the point, what kind of regulation are they fighting actually, and what are the issues at stake? But first, I would like to hear a voice from us, and I was told you were going to speak about the Washingtonization of Brussels, which sounds very interesting. I mean, we have this, you know, when I hear about Washingtonization and speaking about politics, the first thing that comes to my mind is House of Cards. And there's this place in Brussels, I can't remember what that avenue is called, but there's this place where the cars go down in the tunnel, and it sort of looks like the trailer of House of Cards. So this is what comes up in my mind, but I think you're going to explain better what you're trying to say. And you have the floor to do that in a more serious way than I'm doing it. Go ahead.
That was a good introduction. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the Washingtonization of Brussels and what is Washingtonization. And I want to start with a quote from my co-panelist, Margarida. Brussels never seen this kind of money. There was an article last year in New York Times about the Washingtonization of Brussels and how big tech is has been lobbying in Brussels against the regulatory pressure that is coming from the European Commission. And this quote is from that article. And Margarida was like, "Oh my God, we haven't seen this much of money invested in lobbying." And I was like, "Welcome to our world," because Margarida and I work very closely, and we have conversations, regular conversations, and most of the time I'm like, yeah, this sounds very familiar. So let's talk about the Washingtonization of the concept of Washingtonization. I mean, when we talk about lobbying, we talk about big money in politics. I mean, that's the reality, campaign financing, and you are very familiar with that. Like, you know, this is a very serious problem that we have in the US, and my organization, Public Citizen, has been fighting against the money in politics, and this is one of our priority areas. But the thing is, like, in the last 10 years, you see big tech is investing more and more money in lobbying, in campaign financing, and that's very interesting because in the past we had big oil, big tobacco, and big pharma. We still have big pharma, but big tech was not a big actor. But like in the last few years, especially Facebook and then Amazon, they became the active players in lobbying game. And for instance, in 2020 elections, big tech, the 4 big companies, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple, they invested for 24 million in election campaign finance. So that's a huge amount of money. And I have to say, the big tech lobbies are very influential. And my organization, we've been following. We keep a close eye on the lobbies, and we had a report back in 2019 about big tech lobbying, and at that time they were still new players, and we called them as like new economic titans and old school like tactics. But then, like this year, my colleagues updated that report, and they said that big tech, big cash, because the cash that they invested in both political parties, both Democrats and Republicans, are huge. And I strongly encourage you to have a look at the report, which is written by one of my colleagues. It's a really great report, and it really shows how much like the tech companies have been investing in lobbying. But today I don't want to talk about that. You can read the report. I want to talk about the other tactics, and especially the revolving door, because I think that really makes a difference. We know that there is money involved in politics. We know that these companies have been investing in congressmen in both parties. But what we know that much, although we know, like we've been working on that, what public doesn't know is like the revolving door. There is a revolving door between the companies and the government. And when I say revolving door, I talk about like government officials switching to companies after their term. And we observe this with the Obama administration appointees, the political appointees. Most of them switch to tech companies. It used to be pharma back in the day, but pharma is not cool. Tech is the coolest sector in DC. It's and more government officials, they switch to tech companies after their term. But apart from the political appointees, you also have the career staff. When you look at the junior career staff at the FTC, Department of Commerce, United States Trade Representative, USTR, they also have aspirations, and most of them see their positions as a stepping stone to their high paid, cool job at Google or Facebook. So it is a serious problem. And for instance, Amazon hired 247 government officials in the last 10 years. And apart from the revolving door, we have a reversed revolving door, which we experience with the Biden administration. We experience it with every administration, but we experience particularly with the Biden administration because Biden administration was very ambitious, and then most of the high level people at Biden administration have connections to tech companies. And it's not only the administration; it's also the Congress. The new Congress people hired the lobbyists or the tech people as their staffers, and that makes a huge difference, because I call this the revolving door as a conversation among friends, and it is the conversation among friends. And working in DC for the last 10 years and working on tech issues, they always make you feel like you're an outsider. It is very important. We talk about public interest lobbying, but we have to accept the fact that we are outsiders because we are not one of them. And that's a conversation they have among each other, because they have the backgrounds. They share the same backgrounds and same aspirations. And apart from the revolving door, and Margarida mentioned that, the think tanks, research, academics, that's also the reality here. We have many think tanks which receive funding from tech companies. They make the case for them. They defend tech positions. You see lots of academic articles supporting the tech arguments. And adding credibility to what tech has been saying. This is the reality. And then there is grass tops. Like, I don't know whether you heard this term, but that was new for me. Like, because tech companies, they place op-eds from third parties, such as SMEs, from like ordinary people, from like think tanks, academics in newspapers. And like, there is this antitrust movement in the US, and you see like in local newspapers, op-eds from like small businesses saying that, oh, no, we shouldn't regulate tech. This is not good for SMEs. So the tactics are that there are lots of tactics that tech companies have been using, but I have to say they are doing their job really, really well, and they are the most influential in DC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That doesn't sound too promising, the Washingtonization, but it does sound familiar, I have to say, because we have a very serious revolving door issue in Brussels as well, in Europe in general, and Brussels in particular, that we're quite aware of. And I won't quote the examples, but I think there are quite a lot that come to the top of our head when we think about revolving doors, public affairs in tech companies, the Commission, national governments, and so on. So yeah. Let's hope we can fight this. I would like to pick up one of the last things you said, because you said they sent the SMEs. They say, oh, the message is we are good for SMEs, and SMEs. There's one thing that everybody in Brussels in politics reads at 7 o'clock in the morning, the first coffee, and that's Playbook, and that's a newsletter. It's a political newsletter. And I think we more or less all read it, and in order to know what the day brings, what the news are, what we might have missed. And this morning, as many other mornings, there was an ad of Facebook saying 70% of the SMEs surveyed by us or asked by us, interviewed by us, and well, who did you interview? But people don't notice, say that our advertising is good for their business. And so that's what people read, and this is the message they keep repeating right now. This is really exactly the strategy, the tactics that they've been using. They started using, I started noticing very strongly in August, when this came up in my Twitter feed and my Insta feed, and what is it doing in my Insta feed anyway? And everybody is saying it, even the Commission. Well, we can't ban it because it's good for small and medium enterprises. So name any economic sector where you have a concentration of power of two companies, 70% in Germany and France, I think 80, 90 globally, and that build a cartel among each other, as you know, in the US, because the lawsuits going on. And governments would say, oh, that must be good for small and medium enterprises if we have two big companies controlling it all. No, so it's so ridiculous, and they still keep making this argument, and everybody repeats it. So I wanted to speak a little bit about what is at stake. And the big issue that is at stake, or one of the really big issues that are at stake right now, is targeted advertisement, is the whole business model. Because while the DSA is going to put stronger rules on illegal content and so on, I think the companies can live with that. What they can't live with was anything that would attack the business model. And therefore, I was wondering, John, you have a long experience in the digital world, because the other argument they bring is, oh, if we don't do targeted advertisement anymore, people will have to pay for our services, because now it's free, and this is because of our business model. And if you kill that business model, people will have to pay for it. Is that so, John? How do you see, how has the sector involved? What is your contribution to this conversation?
Well, I have a rather long story as working with tech and competing with these guys. I actually started doing the web in 1992. Started doing web browsers in 1994. This is the time when the number of sites in the world is like 100. So pretty early days. And so I've been competing with these guys for the longest time. And I even brought a case to the EU at a time. This is many years ago, and it was about Microsoft. And I think they kind of learned their lesson a little bit, that they need to spend more money on lobbying. It cost them, I think, €500 million at the time, and they needed to provide a browser choice in Windows. So I've seen it from that side. But I think in a lot of ways, these guys, they would like to tell you a story, and the story just isn't true. Now, I was doing a little bit of a comparison. Okay, how did things look a few years ago? Let's go back to 2010. Do you remember the time when actually the top song at the time was called TikTok? I think it's kind of interesting with a certain company with the same name, but that's a small detail. But the motto of Google was "Don't be evil," and actually at that time, that was the feeling with Google. Facebook was a place where you meet friends, and the posts that you saw were actually based on what you were subscribing to. And by the way, Facebook had not gone public yet. The most irritating ads that you found at the time were pop-ups. Now, those were really frustrating, and very quickly, browser makers, we put in ways to block pop-ups. And the ads at the time were context related. So if you're going to a tech site, you'd see tech ads, fashion site, fashion ads. And I think it was actually working pretty well. In reality, I mean, for me at the time, and for the whole time, has been, okay, we only get as many people onto the internet as possible, because the internet is about equal access to information, and that's a good place to be, and good for the world. And then actually things have changed a little bit, but it's just in the last few years. And if you think about it, at the time, there was a lot of sites, I mean, news sites and the like were free. I mean, New York Times, Washington Post, Aftenposten in Norway, all of those sites were free. And I think they were able to make money to some extent, at the very least, with ads. And that's because the ads you pay premium in certain positions, and then you pay less in other positions, which is kind of the opposite, because the ads are now following the person. So basically what we've seen is that, I mean, Google can't use "Don't be evil." Facebook is basically become a programming tool for us humans. The ads are following us everywhere, and the price follows the person, which means actually has changed the business model for a lot of companies which are now struggling, that were not struggling before the change of business models. I think you can probably find someone that will tell you that the ads that Facebook has, they're good in some way to reach an audience, but the reality, you had more ways of reaching audience before. And I think in a way, so this is a change of business models. There's winners and losers, but the real question is, who had this idea that it was okay to collect vast amounts of information on people? Why should it be allowed? Is it correct that certain companies, just because they've been doing it for some time, that they're allowed to continue to do it? We went out, and I mean, this is, for me, this is a bit personal, because again, I've spent most of my life trying to get people on the internet, trying to make the internet the best possible place in the world for access to information and the like. And when a couple of companies basically think that they can get away with collecting whatever information they can find in whatever way they can, build profiles on us, and think that that's okay. I mean, it wasn't okay when I was starting, where the idea was you can't share information that you have on your customer with anyone else. So how did that rule or law or whatever fall off a cliff? And again, just because companies have been ethically challenged for a number of years, why should we all have to accept that that's the case? Again, so we went out and I've been talking about this for a number of years, because I'm pretty pissed off about this, and we actually went out and supported the Norwegian Consumer Council when they went out and said, okay, we need to stop this, we need to ban this. And I mean, I can tell you there is only one way to fix this. It is to ban it. There isn't any halfways. We see when we try to do things like with the GDPR and with the little dialogues that ask people, do you want to kind of let me collect information about you? The intention was good, but the reality doesn't work. You actually have to go all the way. You just have to say, okay, you have to ban it. There is no other way. And I've seen other discussions on this today where there were kind of people who were saying, okay, no, we shouldn't ban this. But when they were asking about the specifics, it became really difficult. And that's because it is really difficult. There is only one way, and you have to ban it, and you need to ban it sooner rather than later, because in the space of a few years, we've gone from a situation where we can actually have nice discussions to, in the US, people discussing, okay, we have Thanksgiving coming up. How are we going to make sure that we don't kill each other during Thanksgiving? Basically, don't talk politics, don't do this, don't do that. I mean, that's a pretty dire situation that has happened in a short time. So think about if they manage to do this in the space of 5 to 10 years, what can they do if you allow them to continue?
I couldn't agree more. I just survived the German electoral campaign. We had elections on Sunday, and I've never seen anything like that in Germany. And Germany is supposed to be a country with very solid, reliable, democratic, traditional media, very strong, that people believe in. And the disinformation campaign was just incredible. I'm a little partial here because the candidate of my party was particularly affected. I have to admit, full disclosure, but you know, I really do canvassing. I go in the street, and the stories people told me about this woman were just, I mean, it was like looking at them and, well, are you really believing what you're saying? And they did, and those were normal people. I mean, they were not stupid. It was really amazing. Before I start talking, Professor Valletti, are you with us? We've seen you a little bit in and out and moving around. Are you with us? Can I give you the floor? Then I would introduce you briefly. You are Professor of Economics at Imperial College Business School at the University of Rome. You have previously taught at the London School of Economics, Telecom, Paris Tech, École Polytechnique, and in Turin. And you have also been the chief competition economist at the European Commission. So if you have an experience in the Commission, but you are an academic, and I think you are best placed to speak a little bit about lobbying, academics, advocacy, and how this all gets together, and why it has become so difficult for me as a policymaker to get independent academic advice and insight. You have the floor, and you have a few minutes because we're sort of running out of time. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. And apologies if you hear some background noise. It is because it's my fault. I completely screwed up on the time zone. And so as I was cycling home, I realized that there was the call going on. And so I'm joining from Russell Square in central London. So if there is noise, it is because there is noise around, but I apologize for that. So I'm going to give you a few observations out of my experience as an academic that had a policy stint. The first observation I had in Brussels is that there is lots of these seminars, workshops, meetings, cocktails happening daily. Multiple of them in Brussels and in Washington, D.C. would be the same. And there is some academics invited, and there is zero disclosure. So the first very simple lesson is that there is never a disclosure of conflict of interest. So this is an easy thing perhaps to change. We can change that kind of convention and disclose very clearly and be very transparent of who's doing what and why. So the first thing was lack of disclosure. The second thing which I realized is that the policymakers cannot tell the distinction between scholar work, some real academic work, and the lobbyist advocacy work. They cannot tell this difference, which is a problem, because sometimes you may have somebody, I'm an economist, you may have a discussion about climate change, you have some scientists publishing in Science and Nature, and then you have someone else producing a pamphlet for the policy purposes, and in my field, by the policymakers, that would be seen as one positive and one negative, and of course one is should have a big weight and the other one should have a zero weight. But the policymakers are not able to tell the difference between advocacy and academic research. Perhaps they They shouldn't be able to tell the difference, but there should be a system to tell them how to interpret the different things. Related to this second observation I have is, and precisely related to that, is the fact that there is a whole industry which defines itself as a semi-academic. They call themselves professors. Of course, it's nothing to do with the career which I've done. They never published anything. However, there are people like, I don't know, centers in antitrust like the Global Antitrust Institute at the George Mason University and a few others that actually produce these pamphlets whose purpose, I would say, is to produce doubt. What you need in the policy sphere in order not to move the dial is not to do, extravagant advocacy, but just to put the doubt that more research is needed. If more research is needed, that's exactly what you need in order for the policymakers to become a bit shy. They don't know whether they should take a decision or not, even if the evidence is overwhelmingly in a certain direction. There is even a word which is agnotology, which is the science of producing doubt. Okay, and this has happened before. It's happened when it was clear that tobacco was causing cancer, but the tobacco industry sponsored not studies to say that tobacco was actually good for health, but that cancer had a lot of other reasons that were much more important, the doubt. Similar thing when it comes to climate change. Similar thing now when we're talking about big tech. Yes, but you don't want to destroy all the benefits, although the discussion now is not really to shut down Google. Facebook is a different example, but the examples that we're having is to introduce regulation which are pro-competitive. But with the doubt, you have policymakers, even if they are not corrupt themselves, they're shy, they're civil servants, they don't have the resources to fight battles against these almighty companies. I want to remind ourselves that as of today, if you add up the market capitalization of GAFAM, the Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft together, you get close to $10 trillion. That's an amount which is difficult even to imagine. Just to put in a perspective, the GDP of Japan is half of it, and Japan is the third economy in the world, and the next in line would be China. So we're talking about a market capitalization which is close to the GDP of China. That's pretty amazing. So this is economic power, political power. It's a global problem. So we need to find a global solution as well. The solution you talked about would be some is transparency, but also what I would call, and then I will finish, a collective action problem. I think it's an interesting moment where there is unprecedented willingness to find a solution. There is actually good academics out there, there is civil society, but we don't have the resources because in my job as an academic, I have to teach, I have to do my research, and on the side, in my free time, like tonight going back home, I'm very happy to participate to this, but we don't have the organization behind us. A collective action problem means that we need some funding, probably public funding, in order to be able to express a common acknowledged views about very important societal problems. And including in this collective action problem is access to data. The paradox when it comes to the GAFAM, to the problems which are related to the Facebook, the Google, the Amazon, is that they're sitting on an unprecedented trove of data, yet nobody can do any independent academic research with such data because the companies never gave any such data to independent researchers. They just do something in-house. Facebook is telling us everything is fine. Instagram is okay for teenagers, and we have to believe them. Instead, the only way to get out of it is through government regulation to make sure that data, anonymized, of course, put on the secure servers where people can have access through making some queries because of a research project they might have. But this should be accessible to an academic community, which is actually waiting to do this to give the answers. And the answers are in the data, and the data have been there for 20 years. But contrary to other industries, this is the only industry where you cannot look inside the box. And this is part of the problem, which is retarding, delaying any kind of interventions we may want to take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tommaso. Maybe on a positive note, the access to data for academia is actually in the DSA so far. It's in the Commission's proposal. We are trying to extend it in order to give also that possibility, for example, to investigative journalists, to NGOs with some safeguards. And I think that might be some good news coming from Europe to have access to data. I have a different question. I mean, I have so many questions, but I take one question from the audience and then I have some more. Maybe to whoever wants to answer this. And the question is that basically that those companies are sitting on the new oil, which are the behavioral data sets. And what could we do to sort of democratize those data sets? Here there's the suggestion in the question to have like a UN register for all existing data sets. Or should we just ban targeted advertisement and enforce GDPR? This is what I'm adding, in order to make sure that no new personal data is collected and that the existing data sets become more and more obsolete. So how do we handle all this existing data? And this is actually an interesting question, because you have the lobbying of the GAFAM on targeted advertising, but you also have lobbying of publishers, also European publishers, because they are in this dilemma situation that the revenue is being strongly reduced by targeted advertisement by Google and Facebook. And I think, John, you explained that very well. But at the same time, still part of a targeted advertisement and their own data is part of their revenue, and they're really afraid to be cut off that revenue for a year or two until a new model kicks in and not to survive that time. So how can we deal with the existing behavioral data sets? Do you have any solution to propose for that? Anybody? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, if I may, I mean, I just think this is something that never should have been collected or used in this way whatsoever. So basically, it's been a misuse of data. Now, obviously, there is going to be a lot of data that will be collected. My view has always been, if you have data on your customers, you keep it safe. You don't misuse it in any shape or form. You shouldn't be collecting more data than you need. I mean, I'd like to talk about kind of examples. Kind of, you wouldn't expect your mailman to read your mail. You wouldn't expect your phone company to listen to your calls. You wouldn't expect your carpenter to kind of put a list of the furniture you have in your house. We have a working model that was working before, just a few years ago, which is the contextual ads. Now, granted, that may be a little bit difficult for companies like Facebook, and maybe that's why they felt they had to go in this direction, because you can't really put contextual ads related to what people are saying at the time. That would kind of be creepy. So I think they would end up with rather special, kind of just normal ads. And the reality is ads that are not contextual would get you less paid, right? So so they went from being maybe paid very little for advertisement to being paying very much for advertisement because they were providing so much more information. But I mean, the model was working. I think we could go back to contextual ads. I don't think we need to collect this information. I get kind of very, I think in some ways the concept of calling this oil is correct, because oil is ruining the planet. So from that perspective, it's about time that we stop collecting this oil. I mean, if we have seen in just a few years the damage that this has done, isn't it time to stop? I mean, we have the documentation on this. It's kind of like with asbestos. We found out that asbestos was killing it initially, that maybe it was having a useful use. People actually thought it was a good thing. Then they figured out it was actually very dangerous, and then it should be stopped. Now, the difference for me is that these companies should never have been doing what they're doing. I just think it's highly unethical to be collecting information on the customers and building profiles on them. And when they see the consequences of their actions over the years, I mean, one thing is, it's kind of like with the cigarettes, right? You may think initially that it wasn't, but when you spend all the resources on trying to convince people, no, it wasn't me, it has nothing to do with me. But they know that they are what they've done. And I think for all the employees of those companies also, they need to step up and speak out, because you don't want to be working for companies that are basically ruining the planet. So it's time to do a change.
So I want to.
I totally agree, and I really, I'm sorry, but we're sort of wrapping up. I really like that image of the tobacco industry, and for a series of reasons that have been explained also by Tommaso Valletti. But there's one good thing, that actually the number of people smoking in Europe and in the US especially has declined steadily in the past years. So that is a battle that has been won. So in terms of lobbying in Brussels and maybe in Washington as well, Margarida and Burcu, it's a question to you too. You have like a couple of minutes each, I think. What do we need to do to have the same victory that we have had over tobacco, and maybe even a better one? What can we do to have more transparency, to have a balance between companies and citizens, and really to be able to fight this fight?
Yeah, I mean, the tobacco example, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the tobacco example is really interesting, because I think that a crucial piece of the puzzle in addressing the power of the tobacco industry has been the recognition that the lobbying by the tobacco industry itself has been prejudicial. So the World Health Organization signed an agreement saying that the interests of tobacco lobbyists are directly counter the interests of the public interest. And not only that, as the tobacco companies had lied and manipulated or influenced the way that research had come out. As a result of that, the WHO created a treaty, an agreement that many institutions, many governments signed up to, saying that they would limit the interactions with tobacco lobbyists to the bare minimum. This is something that we could discuss whether it could fit to tech or not. I certainly think that overall, we need to change the approach, and the institutions need to change the approach to lobbying, not relying quite as much on corporate lobbying, having more discussions in the public where you can actually bring in different voices. So you're not just talking to the Google representative or the Facebook representative, but you actually have public interest campaigners that are there, and independent academics that are there that can actually like live fact check the claims and the research of the lobbyists. And overall, also taking these discussions a little bit outside of the Brussels bubble. We have quite an interesting setup here. That means that we are a little bit closed in ourselves, and quite often the discussions don't make it into national level, into the communities that are actually impacted by the proposals. We need to figure out a way.
Margarida, I have to stop you here because I think I have to cut up really at 35, and I wanted to give the floor to Burcu. But thank you very much for those really constructive proposals. Thank you. Burcu, what is your view from Washington? What can we do to fight this industry?
Okay, I have to be the devil's advocate here, and I'm going to tell you that the big tobacco is still very powerful in Washington, D.C. They gave up on American smokers, and now they are giving up on European smokers, but they have high expectations from smokers in Southeast Asia and Africa. So I think it's very important for us to, think global, act local, I mean, because the tech issue is the same issue. Like tech, like after the GDPR, they gave up on like the Europe in terms of privacy, but they've been pushing back on privacy reforms in other countries, especially in the US. So it's very important for us to coordinate, collaborate, and push back all together. It is like that. I think global part it's important, and I think it's a very important part of the puzzle. But apart from that, like I agree with everything Margarida said. Like the research is very important. We don't need more evidence. We need to sell our research. That's something I think we need to work on, because the big tech research or industry research, they managed to sell their research. They communicated well. We need more funding, because we are only few like good people out there fighting against big industry lobbyists. But we also need the public, SMEs, and politicians like you on our side, because we can really push back. I mean, we did that before with the other industries. So every industry has been through this, and it's time for big tech now. They are no longer the good guys in town.
Great. Thank you so much. We have to cut here because we have a great keynote from Bob Hoffman coming in, and I don't want to keep the audience. So I would like to very warmly thank all the speakers. Thank you so much for having been with us. I think this has been a very insightful, very fascinating panel. Follow us all on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Unfortunately, for a politician, we have to be there in order to be present. That's our personal prisoner's dilemma. I have a newsletter as well that you can sign up to, where you find news on digital policy in the Brussels bubble, and maybe sometimes outside, more in the Brussels bubble. The recording will be online soon, so if you have registered and you have agreed to receiving a follow-up email, you will see where you can see the recording. Then good night to everybody based in Europe, good morning or good day to everybody in the US, and wherever you are, have a wonderful day, and above all, stay healthy. Thank you so much for being with us.